Hello, and welcome to the 9th webinar of the Heritage Science Academy series in 2022. This is the Academy lecture series, the Academy webinar series of the European Research Infrastructure for Heritage Science and of the IPERION Heritage Science project. My name is Matija Strlič, and I will be moderating today's webinar. This is on a very interesting and particular topic and will be given by Dr. Cecilia Bembibre, who completed her PhD at University College London's Institute for Sustainable Heritage, where she is now lecturer involved in the delivery of the Sustainable Heritage Masters. She previously researched smell at the Faculty of Social Sciences, University of Buenos Aires in Argentina, and she is interested in an interdisciplinary approach to smell and the preservation of olfactory heritage. She collaborates with numerous research groups, also through the Odeuropa research project, in which she is responsible for the Olfactory Heritage Science work package. She's keen to explore the potential of olfactory characterization of historic and heritage odors and how these could become part of glam narratives more centrally. In addition, she has more than 15 years of publishing and organizational experience. I should say that there is a question and answer button at the bottom of your screen, so please use that in order to record your questions, which we will attempt to respond to at the end of the webinar. However, the Q&A session will not be recorded. Over to you, Cecilia.
Unmute my audio. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for attending this presentation. I'm going to minimize this to avoid distraction. I'm very pleased to be able to share some of the work that we are doing in the emerging field of olfactory heritage. And today I will be presenting research around preserving the smells of sites and collections. So we will be talking about 4 aspects. It's a new field, so I'm going to assume there's a presentation needed. So I'll be talking a little bit about the connection between smell and heritage. Then we'll discuss preservation of the smell of sites and collections. I'll present some of the challenges and resources we have for working with smells in museums. And finally, some ideas for next steps on olfactory heritage research. To start with, I just want to bring our attention to the fact that we perceive the world with all our senses, 5 senses. But when it comes to heritage, in the last couple of 100 years, we've been asked to engage mostly our vision. So our experience of collections and sites tends to be at a distance, and our knowledge of them tends to be most developed towards the visual aspect. This brings a lack of utilization of our other senses, although they have an enormous impact on our behavior, our thoughts, and our emotions. And it brings also a huge opportunity. So when we talk about smell and heritage, it might be helpful to present how different communities, how different countries face the sensory aspects of their heritage and what steps they have taken to identify them, preserve them, document them, protect them, and communicate them. And a clear definition of what olfactory heritage is in the work, but I'll advance this working definition, which involves the smells that are meaningful to a community or to a group because of their connections with places, with objects, with people, or events. And for these, they have value and are worthy of being researched and documented as heritage for future generations. Now I'll present 4 examples of the identification and protection of smell and heritage, or olfactory heritage. The first one is via citizen science, citizen participation. And this was the case of 2001, where Japan's Ministry for the Environment invited citizens to vote for places in the country that had a special smell. And not just a special smell, but that where the smell was connected to the identity of the place and brought a sense of dignity to visitors. This is the quote, a sense of dignity. They received lots of applications and they selected 100 fragrant places, which are now promoted as part of Japan's heritage tourism. The list is very diverse. So you have, as you can see in the picture, natural landscapes, but you also have second-hand bookshops, commercial streets, sake distilleries, religious temples, etc. And all these places have in common the fact that they can be experienced with the nose as well as with the eyes. And that experience brings a sense of well-being and dignity, where the smell is an integral part of it. The second example is a protection of know-how. And this is the UNESCO inscription of the city of Grasse in France in 2018 as intangible heritage of humanity. Grasse is a place where for many centuries there have been industries, first tanneries and an industry of leather, and later an industry around perfume and the knowledges and traditions and practices associated with the cultivation of fragrant plants and distillation of essential oils, and then around perfume making. And this is the first and most important to date inscription of intangible cultural heritage mentioning smell. Then on the lower left quadrant, we have a French sensory law. So another way in which smells have become heritage are by being protected by law. And this is a law passed in January 2021 in France, where the sensory heritage, the sensory patrimony of the countryside has been protected. This includes the smells and the sounds that are characteristic of the countryside. This protection did not have heritage at the forefront, I have to say. It resulted from an attempt to regulate many environmental odor complaints around the countryside, but nevertheless, it's the first law that regulates the protection of smells of a certain place as heritage. And finally, smell as an identity symbol in the heritage of a region. And this is a touristic, a tourism campaign called Feel Slovenia, where the Ministry of Tourism encourages visitors to come to Slovenia and experience the land with all the senses. In this case, the smell of the sea and salt. They also have a campaign that highlights the botanical knowledge. So it's this idea that our senses can bring us closer to the identity of a space, developing the sense of place in connection with the landscape and with the cultural heritage of the place. So when we talk about smells in heritage, what kind of smells are we talking about really? As part of the Odeuropa project, we have identified 4 aspects of smells, 4 types of smells. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's very helpful to get us started. The first one is smells as objects in themselves. And these objects have cultural significance. Myrrh, for example, or civet, or historical perfumes. They're standalone, they carry deep associations with historical practices, places, and events, and they can be studied in the case of historical perfumes, for example, is the source of smell as itself, as a collection object. Secondly, we have smells as attributes of historic objects and spaces. And as I was saying before, they carry valuable information about objects, spaces, and the past. And this is what makes them worthy of study and protections. This is smells as attribute of material heritage mostly, so smells of objects in museum collections, for example. The third one are smells associated with cultural practices that have value to a certain community. And we're here in the realm of intangible cultural heritage, for example, incense burning in churches, the use of the nose in certain crafts, I'll give some examples later, or the UNESCO listing that I was mentioning in the previous slide. And finally, smells in heritage research and presentation. In this line of research, often we work with perfumers to develop recreations of historic smells that can be presented to visitors in museums. So this is a separate category where the level of authenticity of these smells varies depending on the methodology and the transparency with which they are communicated, but yet they can become heritage in certain cases, or at least be considered part of heritage in association with other objects. So once we decide that there are smells that carry heritage value and we have interest in preserving them, what's the next step? And here, during my PhD, I developed a 3-step framework to this effect, and we're very fortunate to have 2 international research projects at the moment, continuing and improving the work towards a step 4. And I'll go step by step. So firstly, we want to establish the significance. Why do we want to preserve a smell? Not every historic smell is a heritage smell. So we are interested in obtaining the evidence that allows us to put this smell in context, establish their importance, connect it to places, to people, to artworks. This can be also the case for living heritage. So we conduct participatory research to describe the importance of the smell and tie it to practices or knowledge or tradition. And then we create a file, a metadata for this smell with the evidence of its significance. Step 2 is focus on describing the smell. So we want to do odor characterization. A smell is, of course, a sensation, but we start with the very beginning. We start with doing volatile organic compound analysis to understand which compounds are responsible for that smell, for that scented environment, and that in that way we can describe them chemically. This is complemented with sensory description. I'll talk a little bit about the techniques we use for this in a minute. So we conduct sensory evaluation to talk about the quality of a smell, if it's fresh or green or floral, the intensity of a smell on a given scale, the hedonic tone or the pleasantness of a smell, and we record this information along the chemical data as part of the characterization. Finally, we combine the data obtained in the previous step into an archival tool. In this case, for example, you can see an aroma wheel that combines quality descriptors, sensory descriptors, and chemical data. And this can be used as a documentation tool, but also as an engagement tool in museums, as a training tool as well for heritage professionals, etc. And then there's other pieces of other pieces of documentations that we need to convey the significance of the smell to future generations, because of course the sensibility and the sensitivity towards smell depends very much on the time of history, the historic period we live in, our description of smells before, of food smell, let's say, before the fridge was invented was very different. Our tolerance as well, because our environments change constantly. So it is important to anchor the documentation of a smell in a time and a place, and this is what we're hoping to do with this archive. And step 4 tends to do with archival and communication of the smell to museum visitors, for example, or to wide audiences, involves often recreating the smell from the data obtained. And here it is where I would like to mention these 2 European projects, Odeuropa and Odeuropa. I will talk a little bit about Odeuropa later because it's a project that I'm deeply involved with. But I would like to say that the colleagues from Odeuropa, which is a Slovenian-Polish joint project, are developing important methodology for archiving smells with heritage value and reproducing them as well. So here we have an example. This is a case study I worked on as part of my PhD, and it is the preservation of the historic library at St. Paul's Cathedral in London. First step, we assess the site significance. This is a very particular library because it's inside the church. So you have several kinds of scented environment that account for the experience of the library. You go from central London with the car fumes and the many restaurants around the cathedral into a space where incense is burned. And then you open the doors to the library, and this library used to have a very intense smell noted by visitors who left many comments in the visitors' book attesting to the way they perceive the smell of the library as part of its identity. One of the quotes said, "We can inhale the knowledge by smelling the library." So this is a smell that was important to visitors. And I'm speaking in the past because the library has been undergoing work in the last couple of years. It's closed until next spring. They have removed all the collection, and we can assume that it no longer smells as it used to. So here we conducted smell characterization. Here you have headspace solid phase microextraction sampling the VOCs in the library, which was taken then to the lab for gas chromatographic mass spectrometric analysis. There's a chromatogram there that you can see representing visually the compounds responsible for the smell of the library. And then I went with a sensory panel to account for the human perception of the smell of the library and describe it according to set standards. And then I developed the historic book aroma wheel. It's a tool for documentation and archival. In this case, we went a step further and we went into trying to understand how we can perceive a heritage smell authentically. So we reconstructed the smell of the library using the chemical and sensory data from the study, but we also worked with the London-based perfumer who went to the library, smelled it, and created an interpretation that is not chemically faithful to the environment, but it's an account of the perfumer's experience as an artist of the space. And we presented these two different, methodologically different reconstructions of the smell of the library to a panel and asked them which one they thought was better at evoking the smell of a historic library. And we found that 50% of the participants chose the chemically accurate reconstruction as most efficient at evoking the library, and 50% chose the artistic interpretation of the smell of the library as most efficient. So we are now deepening our understanding of how authenticity is perceived in historic smells. But this is basically how scent preservation works in action. And at the moment, of course, we have the only archive of this space that has now lost its smell. So I was talking about volatile organic compound characterization. This is a little bit of a close-up on the technique. We do headspace solid phase microextraction for sampling, and also 10x tube sampling. And then analysis is GCMS for an identification of the compounds responsible for the smell. And here you have an example of what the output looks like. We can do also quantitative analysis, although most of the analysis we do is qualitative. And then the sensory characterization of the smell is done both with human panels, as I showed in the previous pictures, but also with the instruments. And here we use the technique of gas chromatography olfactometry, or GCO. This is a modified chromatograph with an olfactory port where each peak of the chromatogram can be sniffed and described. We usually describe quality, as you can see in the word cloud next to the picture, and also intensity on a scale of 0 to 6, and hedonic tone or pleasantness on a scale of -4 to +4. And this is to comply with European odor evaluation standards. So museums have jumped on the opportunity of working with smell for a number of reasons. It reveals new knowledge on collections. For example, there are many museum objects that are not transparent in their function, but just adding smell to them, whenever relevant, can explain how the objects were used. For example, carrot wigs that used to spread perfume powder on wigs. It can also make visits more memorable. There's evidence carried out at the Viking Jorvik Museum in York, the Viking Museum in the UK, where people who were exposed to the smells of this visit, the smells of the Viking world, remembered the information of the exhibition better. It also helps focusing on experiences, and this is quite important. We're dealing with young audiences who are really interested in navigating museums and galleries via experiences, engaging all their senses. And of course, due to the way the sense of smell works, it helps foster emotional connections with collections and with exhibits. And finally, it makes museums more accessible to not only to visually impaired audiences, but also to different types of learners. It fosters conversations. You will find that in exhibitions where you have smell, people are always talking. Their behavior sometimes is a little bit unusual to museums. They talk to strangers, they laugh, but this is what embodied learning looks like in a way. So just to give you an overview of the interest on working with smell in museums in the last 2 years, we have here many museums across Europe and beyond that have engaged in different ways of working with smell. I'll give a couple of case studies following. And of course, these 2 European projects that are focused on developing new methodologies and new knowledges around olfactory heritage. So the challenges of working with scent. Normally, a project that involves smell in a museum comes from the curator, originates with the curator or the heritage interpreter, or even perhaps the visitor engagement officer, for the reasons detailed before. And the conservation team or the heritage science team in museums is sometimes involved, most of the time not involved. This is slowly changing. And this conversation is important because our colleagues in the scientific department of museums are one of the key professionals who use their nose as diagnostic tools. So they have a lot to bring to the table, but also it is important that we develop impact assessments when we start working and introducing new VOCs in museums, and balance that, of course, with the value for visitors. So the first, one of the first things to consider is how smells are going to be presented. Here you have a selection of delivery methods from scented objects or little cubes where you lift the lid. These are called point of scent because the scent is contained, and usually it involves the visitor engaging with the device in order to trigger the smell. There are also motion triggers, scented blotters, so little strips of special paper where you can put a smell at the end in liquid form. Then there are wispies, and I have here one of them. These are mini plastic pumps that can carry the smell and release it, scented air near the nose of the visitors. And then you have the larger systems, so nebulization systems for ambient scent. So the choice of delivery method, of course, is directly related to the impact it's going to have on the space, on the experience, but also potential impact on collections. And here I'm going to present some examples of this in action. This is the Prado Museum in Madrid. They developed smells to accompany the sense of smell painting by Bruegel and Rubens. And in the same room, you had 4 of these machines and the painting. They received 100 visitors per hour for several months, and an average of 3 sniffs per person. Sniffs were triggered by touching details of the painting, which was also shown on screen. So, for example, you touch the civet cut in the painting, and then the little port would emanate the smell of civet. And this was for all 10 smells for the exhibition. This is Tate in London, Tate Modern, and they had for 5 months an installation by Annika Yi called In Love with the World, and they distributed 28 ambient scents, 10 hours a day, and visitors could smell something different every 2 weeks. This is a space where, going through the doors, they had other galleries with artworks and metal sculptures. This is the Louvre in Paris, and here they are conducting currently olfactory tours led by a perfumer. These are small groups, and once you sign up, you receive 15 blotters, and you can follow the perfumer interpreting the olfactory dimension of artworks. So as part of the Odeuropa project that I mentioned earlier, we're developing an impact assessment study. This is to assess the impact of introducing new VOCs in the museum, both on collections and on visitors. This is ongoing, and results will be published next year, which is the last year of the project. This project has a digital heart. It's funded by the European Union, and the starting point was to develop new ways of interpreting digital collections. So the collections that museums and libraries have digitized for the past 20 years, access them in a different way, and we chose to access them with the nose. So try to find references to smell in these collections using artificial intelligence techniques and developing sensory mining techniques to bring these references to smells to the front, find out the descriptions, the people smelling, the places where these smells were perceived, and working with historians to restore the stories around these smells, and with scientists to recreate some or preserve those where the sources still exist, those smells, to present them to European audiences in museums. And this is ongoing. And the idea of this is to recognize, safeguard, and promote olfactory heritage as one of the ways to connect with Europe's tangible and intangible cultural heritage. This is a project with 7 partners across Europe, and several collaborations with industry and other organizations and heritage organizations as well. So as I was saying, we're developing a study, and this study was geared towards understanding concerns and barriers around working with smell in museums. So we conducted interviews and surveys, and we developed a decision-making tool as a starting point for working with smell in museums. And this is it. So with the idea of starting working with smell in galleries, libraries, archives, and museums, we have different starting points depending on, usually on which department of the museum is leading this interest. So there are curatorial aspects, or there are scientific aspects, visitor engagement, or exhibition design aspects. And then we're asking key questions: whether their smells are a risk, whether their smells are relevant, whether their smells are safe and engaging, and whether they're suitable for the space. And in the last column, you have a traffic light system where you can see that the resources needed to develop these guidelines fully, the green means they are developed, the yellow are going to be targeted or are being developed during the scope of the project, and the red ones are future work. And I'll focus a little bit on this because I think it's relevant to all of us now. So one of the strands is, of course, the preventive conservation strand, trying to assess the impact, the risk of smells in museums. And for this, we're developing different methodologies. And I just wanted to propose that we think of the next steps in olfactory heritage research and the possibility of developing collaborative projects. And for those, we integrate our existing knowledge of olfactory research and our laboratory capabilities with preventive conservation labs existing in European infrastructures, because they share many of the methodological approaches and also the equipment. So these conservation risk assessments, of course, involve indoor air quality studies, odor qualitative and quantitative characterization, panel evaluation, sensory science, and historical significance assessment. So it's quite interdisciplinary, but we have a good ground for it, and we are developing a toolkit as part of the Odeuropa project, which will be available to heritage professionals and the wider public in 2023. Thank you.